Be dismissed to we worship. We are continuing today our study of the parables. In Matthew chapter 13, last week we began with the first one, and today we're actually going to cover two separate parables, but they kind of go along the lines of one another with some differences and with some similarities, and so I decided to cover them today together. I'm going to begin reading in verse 24 in just a moment. This is one of the two parables that Jesus actually gave his disciples the interpretation of. We talked last week with most of these parables in Matthew chapter 13 that Jesus did not clarify what he meant by them. He left those who were listening, those who were getting the story, they had to mull over it and consider what Jesus might have meant, and he actually did that with the crowd. It was only later, after he left the multitudes, that he actually tells the disciples what he meant by the parable of the wheat and tares, which we're going to read today. I'm going to go ahead and read, begin in verse 24, and I'm going to read through verse 30, and then I'm going to hop down to verse 47 and read through verse 50. These two parables that are somewhat different and somewhat the same. And he presented another parable to them, saying, "The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares," or weeds, if you will, "also among the wheat, and went away. But when the wheat sprang up and bore grain, then the tares became evident also. And the slaves of the landowner came and said to him, 'Sir, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have tares?' And he said to them, 'An enemy has done this.' And the slaves said to him, 'Do you want us then to go and gather them up?' But he said, 'No, lest while you are gathering up the tares, you may root up the wheat with them. Allow both to grow together until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest, I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up. But gather the wheat into my barn.'" Now hold on to that one just a moment, and let's go over to verse 47. This is a different parable on the same setting and the same day. And it says again, "The kingdom of heaven is like a dragnet cast into the sea, and gathering fish of every kind. And when it was filled, they drew it up on the beach and sat down and gathered the good fish into containers. But the bad they threw away. So it will be at the end of the age. The angels shall come forth and take out the wicked from among the righteous, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth." These parables are similar in that the results at the end had to do with fire and burning up the bad and saving the good. But they're different in a couple of respects. And those differences actually are why I want to touch on this today. Because I can tell you that the very first parable here, the parable of the wheat and tares, actually answers one of mankind's oldest and deepest and most troubling questions. At least to some satisfaction. We cannot know everything, but this actually answers one of the questions that I most often hear from people who have confronted the idea of a loving God, and a God who has heaven for those who love Him, and a God who created this world, that it did not come about by accidental evolutionary means. And a lot of people reject that. And you know why they reject that idea? That there's a good God who created a good earth? They always say, if God is so loving, why is there evil in the world? If God is so good, how could He let such and such happen? If God is so loving, how could He allow such a thing to take place? All of us have known of, either personally or through someone that we know and love, or even just through the news, we know of some horrific things that happen that causes people to say, how could a loving God do this? Or how could a loving God allow this to happen? Now, we can give some answers in our own mind that help us as believers to grasp that. But sometimes we can't. Sometimes we don't have an answer. But this first parable about the wheat and tares begins to answer that. I want to remind you that when Jesus goes through all of these parables and we think of them all together, that He says in each one of these, the kingdom of heaven is like. And He goes and He tells the story of whether it's the story, as we got last week, of the sower and the seed, or the sower of the wheat and the tares, or the sower of the net that gathers in all sorts of fish, or the story of the yeast, the pinch of yeast in the loaf, or the story of the mustard seed. All of those, there's a little glimpse of what the kingdom of heaven is like. So it will pay us good results if we pay attention to what He says it's like, because it's valuable for us. If you want to know what the kingdom of heaven is like, this is what it's like. And all told, when you read these things together, we get a real glimpse of truth for us that helps us both to understand it and to live in the kingdom as citizens of the kingdom. But it also helps those who are not yet members of the kingdom to come to understand, so that they can grasp just what the kingdom of heaven is like. Sometimes we get it all wrong, what the kingdom of heaven is like. We begin to imagine sometimes that the church building is the kingdom of heaven, but that's not really what He says here about it. Or sometimes we get the idea that only Christians give us a picture of the kingdom of heaven. But that's not really what this says. I understand that only Christians are actually full-fledged citizens of the kingdom of heaven, but we see the wheat and the tares in this, and the whole process of the kingdom coming is the process by which we are living our lives, not only throughout our generation, but through all the generations. Do you remember in the Lord's Prayer when the disciples came to Jesus and said, Lord, teach us to pray? And He said, when you pray, pray in this manner. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed or holy be your name. May your kingdom come. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You see, the kingdom is both right now. We are citizens of the kingdom, but the kingdom is still coming. And the kingdom is still yet to come in its fullness. So when we understand that the kingdom is both here and we are living as citizens of the kingdom of heaven, almost in a situation of guerrilla warfare. That's really kind of what it's like right now. Because do you remember when Satan came and tempted Jesus after His 40 days in the wilderness? And in one of those temptations, he took Jesus up onto a high mountain, and miraculously He showed Him from that high mountain all of the great civilizations of the world. And do you remember what He said? He said, do you see all of these great cities and kingdoms of the world? If you will bow down and worship Me, I will give you all these kingdoms, because they are in My power to give them to you. And if you notice, Jesus did not rebuke him for that. Jesus did not say, well, that's not true, Satan. The Bible tells us that Satan is the god of this world. And so there's a real sense in which the kingdom has not yet come fully. And so in a sense, we are fighting a guerrilla war. We are citizens of that kingdom. And we are fighting a guerrilla war, kind of behind the lines and secretly, which I can't get on secretly too much because that's coming in a couple of weeks. But we are fighting a guerrilla war. And sometimes we win a battle over here and sometimes we lose a battle over there, or so it seems. And the struggle and the fight is always going on. And yet, we continue to pray, may your kingdom come. And what will that look like? May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. You see, for that reason, sometimes people get this particular, this wheat and the tares parable wrong. Sometimes they try to picture it as though this is talking about the church, where in the church there are people who are Christians and there are people who are not Christians. And you can't really tell them apart because they always talk the same language, but you can't really tell. Some people look like Christians and talk like they are, but they really aren't. And so it's not until the end when you find out who really is and who isn't. But I can tell you that's not what this parable's about. Now, the dragnet, which we'll get in just a minute, the story of the net is a little different story, but hold on to that one for a moment. This is not talking about people who look like Christians and people who don't look like Christians. I've heard preachers who preach that, and because the particular kind of weed seed that the enemy came in and planted looks a lot like wheat when it's growing up, they kind of try to relate that to what happens in the church, where people do look like Christians, but they're not really, and the Lord only really knows, and someday when He comes back, He's going to reveal the truth. Well, that's not what this is about. And the reason I know that that's not what it's about is not because I'm making it up in my head somewhere. It's because Jesus told us what the field is. The field is not the church where there are people who are Christians and people who are not. Because you see, He gave us an explanation. I want you to go with me down to verse 36. It says, He left the multitudes and went into the house, and His disciples came to Him saying, explain to us the parable of the tares of the field. And He answered and said, the one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man. In other words, Jesus. And the field is what? The world. The field is the world. So we're talking about living here amongst, out in our communities, where you work, where you play, where you shop, in your neighborhood, when you go on vacation across the world or wherever you may go, you're in the field where there are some wheat plants growing up and some weed plants growing up. Now you see, here's where the application helps us to understand what's going on in the world. There is the kingdom of heaven now at work. But there is also the enemy's kingdom, the god of this world, Satan's kingdom. And they are intermingled. We get a picture of that after the fall. With the righteous living alongside the unrighteous. We read of Noah's family and how Noah preached for 120 years when he was building the ark. But the whole world, it says the whole world was wicked, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And they were living alongside one another until the flood came and swept away the sons of Satan. And the ark saved the righteous, even though it was only Noah's family. We are living in that world. And quite often we see terrible things happening. And a lot of people say, where is God? And this is a deep question. Where is God when bad things happen? Where is God when our hearts are broken? Where is God when it seems like evil is triumphing? Where is God when it seems like He's nowhere? When it seems like He's silent, or maybe even has His back turned? There's a really good analogy in C.S. Lewis's book, Mere Christianity, when he addresses this very question. When he says, why is there evil in the world? Why do we see all of these evil things happening? And the question he asks is, what would you have? Would you have all bullets turned into marshmallows? And would you have all clubs turned into pillows? But you see, the answer he gives is that takes away our choice to freely come, to freely become a member and a citizen of the kingdom of heaven. The question dealt with here gives us the answer, because he said in the parable, when he was telling the parable, he said, after the enemy sowed it, and the men who were working the field came and they said, we're out of Roundup. Well, they didn't have Roundup back then, and they didn't have Roundup Ready wheat back then, so they had an issue. And he said, do you want us to go through and pull up all of the weeds? He says, no. If you do that, you're going to wind up killing the wheat as well. And honestly, I think this is one of the clear pictures of this parable. You see, if God judges us before the completion of time, or if God judges the world and the evil and the hatred and the envy and the sinfulness and the satanic drive of people to do wrong, if He judges it now before the end, that will be the end. Because mankind is so interwoven with one another. You know, and by the way, that's important for us to understand. When a lot of people say, you know, I can do this, it doesn't hurt anybody else but me. That is not true. We are so tied together that what I do affects you. And what you do affects me. And mankind's fate, for better or for worse, is woven together until the time for harvest comes. Because you see, when the judgment falls, there will be no more time. There will be no more growth. There will be no more human life as we know it now. And I think more than anything else, this parable gives us a glimpse of why the wheat and tares are still growing together in the field. In other words, why is it that God does not just come in and sweep away all the evil? This parable answers that. I want to continue reading in his explanation. I'll begin again in verse 37. The one who sows the good seed is the Son of Man, and the field is the world. And as for the good seed, these are the sons of the kingdom. And the tares are the sons of the evil one. I want to come back to that statement, sons of the evil one, in just a moment. And the enemy who sowed them is the devil. And the harvest is the end of the age. And the reapers are the angels. Therefore, just as the tares are gathered up and burned with fire, so shall it be at the end of the age. The Son of Man will send forth His angels, and they will gather out of His kingdom all stumbling blocks and those who commit lawlessness, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. In that place there shall be weeping, gnashing of teeth. Then the righteous will shine forth as the sun in the kingdom of their Father. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. Do you wish that the world were a kinder place? Do you wish that no more children were abducted? Do you wish that no more drunk drivers killed innocent people? Do you wish that no more wars destroyed complete civilization? Do you wish that you could quit doing those things that have you habitually trapped? There is coming a day when the world will be different. When the new time comes, it says the righteous will shine forth in the kingdom of their Father. But that day is not yet. You see, we are still caught in the growing stage. But please understand this. There are wheat plants, and there are tares or weed plants. Make no mistake, there is a time of judgment and harvest coming. That's both a good thing and a terrifying thing. Now, I'll be honest with you. There are fewer and fewer people who stand in the pulpits these days and preach about the judgment to come. There are fewer and fewer people who give hell as a real option or a real place that will really be filled with the sons of the evil one, as this story tells us. And sometimes we get the wrong idea, and by the way, we should feel mercy and heartache for those who don't yet know Jesus, but quite often we see them as hapless and helpless. And that's very true, but it's deeper than that. When Jesus confronted the Pharisees, when they were trying to challenge His teaching about who He was, that He was the Messiah, and that He had come from the Father, and He looked at them and He said, You're standing against me, but you are of your father the devil. And you do his works because you are his children. You see, there will be no one unjustly sent to hell. There won't be any accidental punishments in hell. But it doesn't have to be punishment. Which brings us to the next parable. Because this is talking about the church. The first one was talking about the whole picture of the world in general. But the second one that he's talking about, he says the kingdom of heaven is like a fisherman's net that's thrown out and they pull everything in. And it's gathered in all into the same net. But when they get to shore, they begin to throw back the carp and the buffalo. Well, they might not throw the buffalo back. They're pretty good if you know how to fix them. But they throw back the fish that will not sell in the market or that are not good to eat. It says they keep the good ones. The kingdom of heaven is like this. He says in verse 49, so it will be at the end of the age. The angels, again, here we get the picture of the angels. The angels will come forth, take out the wicked from among the righteous, and will cast them into the furnace of fire. And there shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. So the kingdom of heaven in this picture is a fish net, reaching out wide and far to gather in everything in its grasp. There will be some who make the cut and some who do not. And it's not an accidental thing. Much as we saw last week, the condition of the soil that received the word determined the outcome or the harvest. And in this case, again, it is the condition or the quality or the kind of the fish that determines whether they wind up in the fisherman's basket or thrown out on the shore to die. Both of these parables give us some parallels that tells us that judgment is coming, that the armies, that the host of heaven will come with their commander-in-chief. The Son of Man will come, as we see him in the book of Revelation, coming with the armies of heaven. And these messengers, these angels of the Lord will come and they will do the sorting. Now I want to talk, as we bring this down to a head, about whether or not that is a comfort to you or a terror. Just as we saw last week that the kingdom of heaven is like soil and the seed sown on it, the quality of the soil determines the outcome. And in the kingdom picture, where it's a field with wheat and weeds growing together, the quality of the plants determine the outcome. And in the last one, the quality of the fish determined where they wound up. This should not be frightening for us. Every person will stand before God and give an account for their life. But it should not be a terror to us whose hearts have been cleansed by the blood of Jesus. The judgment should not be frightening. As a matter of fact, I believe it's Titus, in the book of Titus, that Paul writes and says, we are looking for the blessed hope and the glorious appearing of our great God and Savior, Jesus Christ. You see, it is a blessed hope. It is a glorious appearing, and we are looking for it. When all things will be made right, all hurts will be healed, all wrongs will be righted, all evil will be banished, and the righteous will shine forth as the sun. We ought to be looking forward to that. But every person, wheat or tares, will stand before God. So there's two things that I want us to think about as we bring this down to a close. Number one, do not be discouraged when it seems like evil is winning. Do not give up hope when it seems like wrong is right and right is wrong in the world's eyes. Do not give up hope because the tale is not told yet. The harvest is not ripe yet. The Lord is still in control, and God is keeping a record. And God will right every wrong someday. Be encouraged by that. But on the other hand, this is an either-or thing, and people get it wrong sometimes. Either we are a son or daughter of the kingdom, or we are a son or daughter of the evil one. There's no middle ground. There's no, I'm not going to play on either team. I'm going to do my own thing, and I'll just go my way when I die and fade away and become, mulch for the next generation. That's pretty much what our culture thinks, by the way. But it's not so. So this morning, as we bring it to a close, heaven or hell is black and white. A child of the kingdom or a child of the kingdoms of this world is black or white. Now the story may not be told in your life yet, because one or the other, while one or the other is true, one or the other is not a done deal. God calls us to salvation. God calls us to be children of the kingdom. God calls us to walk into the light and let the blood of Jesus Christ cleanse us from all sin. And so the tale is not yet told yet. We're still living in the field that is the world. But we live there with the knowledge from this passage that the harvest is coming. So today, as we prepare an invitation hymn, we consider where we are, what our future looks like, and how we can be sure that we are in the harvest and not in the furnace at the end of time. And that happens through surrendering to the work of Christ on the cross for us by forgiving us of our sins. And by faith in Jesus Christ, we can come to Him and know that He has saved us, that He has cleansed us, and that we are His children through the forgiveness of sin and through faith in what Jesus did for us on the cross. Let's bow our heads. In just a moment, I'm just going to ask Jenna to play quietly. I don't even want us to stand yet. I just want you with your head bowed and your eyes closed to consider whose kingdom you are in